heat in San Miguel did not just press down. It seeped in. It found its way under a person's collar and into their thoughts, baking the moisture from their resolve until all that was left was a brittle patience. Eleanor Hart, whom everyone called Nell, felt it in the sweat that trickled down her temples, tracing paths through the fine red dust that clung to her skin like a second life. The dust was the first and last thing you knew of the Arizona territory. It rose with the sun and settled with the stars, and in between, it defined the world in shades of rust and ochre. She sat on an overturned barrel in the sliver of shade offered by the cantina's awning, mending a split rein. Her fingers, though slender, were calloused and sure as they worked the awl through the tough leather. Across from her, Rafaela swept the boardwalk with a kind of rhythmic fatalism, her broom raising small, defeated puffs of that same red dust. "The wind is a thief today," Rafaela said, her voice a low, melodic hum against the stillness. "It steals the breath from your mouth before you can even speak." Nell looked up, a faint smile touching her lips. "Then we should speak less and save our breath for cursing the heat." She pulled the waxed thread tight, the knot clean and solid. Her work was not beautiful, but it was strong. It held. "Cursing does not make the frijoles cook any faster," Rafaela countered, leaning on her broom. Her dark eyes, usually bright with mischief, were narrowed against the glare, and it will not stop Silas Boone from smiling that snake smile of his. The name hung in the air, heavy as the heat itself. Silas Boone, the railroad man. He had arrived in San Miguel 2 months ago with polished boots, a crisp suit, and a smile that never reached his eyes. He spoke of progress and prosperity, of connecting their small, sun-scoured town to the rest of the country. But what the people of San Miguel heard was the rumble of an approaching earthquake, one that threatened to shake their world from its foundations. He was buying up land, or acquiring it through means that left a sour taste in the mouth. People were being pushed out, their small homesteads and water rights swallowed by the insatiable appetite of the coming rails. "He is not a snake," Nell said quietly, testing the strength of her repair. "A snake gives a warning before it strikes. Mr. Boone just smiles and takes what he wants." As if summoned by the mention of his name, Boone himself rode down the town's main street. He was flanked by 2 men whose hands never strayed far from their pistols. Riding just behind them, looking unsteady in his saddle, was Deputy Kincaid. The lawman's face was perpetually flushed, a testament to the whiskey that served as his closest companion. He was Boone's shadow, a tarnished badge meant to give the man's acquisitions the flimsy veneer of legality. Boone saw the 2 women and tipped his hat, the gesture smooth and practiced. His smile was a flash of white in his sun-darkened face, a predator's grin. Nell gave a curt nod, her expression unreadable. Rafaela simply turned her back and resumed her sweeping with renewed vigor. "He looks at this valley and sees only a line on a map," Rafaela muttered once they had passed. "He does not see the juniper, or the way the mesas turn purple when the sun sets. He does not see us." "Oh, I think he sees us," Nell replied, her voice tight. "He sees us as obstacles, temporary ones." She coiled the mended rein and stood, brushing the leather dust from her trousers. She did not wear the cumbersome skirts favored by the few other Anglo women in town. Her attire was practical sturdy trousers, a simple cotton blouse, and worn leather boots. It was the clothing of a person who worked, who understood that life in this place was a negotiation with a harsh and unforgiving land. Her stepfather, a man named Jedediah, saw it as an affront. He had taken her in after her mother passed, a duty he performed with grim reluctance. He ran a small cattle operation, and in his world, a woman's place was in the house, not the stable. He did not understand that for Nell. The scent of horse and leather was the only perfume she had ever cared for, the only thing that felt like home after her mother was gone. "You should find a husband. "Eleanor," he would say, his voice thick with disapproval, "a woman needs a man to provide for her, to protect her." She never argued. She had learned early that arguing with Jedediah was like trying to reason with the north wind. It heard you, but it did not care. Instead, she would retreat into herself, to the quiet, fiercely guarded space where her own dreams lived. And the most precious of those dreams was freedom. Not the grand, abstract freedom that politicians spoke of, but a small, personal liberty, the right to choose her own path, to make her own decisions, to own her own life without being beholden to any man, be it a stepfather or a husband. Later that afternoon, in the quiet of her small room, she took out the letter. The paper was yellowed and brittle with age. The ink faded to a pale brown. It was from her mother's brother, her Uncle Thomas, a man she barely remembered, a prospector and an adventurer who had died years ago. He had left her nothing of monetary value, save for one peculiar inheritance, the deed to a water station and horse relay. The property was situated at the mouth of a narrow canyon a day's ride from town, a place called Heart Spring. "It is not much. Eleanor," the letter read, the script a confident, looping hand, "just a reliable spring and a small cabin. But in this country, water is life, and control of it is a kind of power. The canyon is a bottleneck. Anyone wanting to move goods or cattle through the North Valley has to pass by it. Hold on to it. A piece of land that is truly yours is the closest thing to freedom a person can have in this world." She traced the words with her finger. A piece of land that is truly yours. Jedediah had dismissed it as a useless piece of rock. Too remote, he had grumbled. Too close to Apache territory. But Nell had held on to the deed, a secret promise she had made to herself. It was her one tangible claim to a life of her own making. Around her neck, on a thin silver chain, she wore a small, simple cross. It had been her mother's. It was not faith she clung to, not in the way the town preacher, Father Deacon, spoke of it. For Nell, the cross was a compass. When the world felt adrift, when her own resolve wavered, the cool, smooth metal against her skin reminded her of her mother's quiet strength, of the woman who had crossed a continent for a new life, who had taught her to read and to shoot and to believe in the resilience of her own heart. She knew how to use the small handgun that rested in a holster at her hip, just as she knew how to stitch leather and set a broken bone on a calf. She was not a delicate flower from the East. She was a daughter of this hard, beautiful land, and her roots were deeper than anyone, even her stepfather, suspected. The news that Boone's Railroad was planning a route that would cut right through the North Valley had turned her uncle's letter from a distant dream into an urgent reality. If Boone controlled the valley, he would certainly want the water at Heart Spring. The strategic importance of the location, the bottleneck her uncle had written of, was now terrifyingly clear. That evening, the confrontation she had been avoiding finally came. Jedediah cornered her as she was coming in from the stable. "Silas Boone made me an offer today," he said, not meeting her eye. He was cleaning his nails with the tip of a knife. A good price for the northern pasture. More than it's worth. Nell's blood ran cold. The northern pasture bordered the canyon. It bordered her land. "You are not thinking of selling." He finally looked at her. His eyes narrowed. "It is my land, girl. I will do with it as I please. Boone is bringing progress. A man would be a fool to stand in its way." "And what happens to the families he is pushing out?" she asked, her voice low but steady. "What happens when he owns all the water and charges a price no one can afford?" "That is not my concern," he snapped. "My concern is this ranch, and you. It is past time you were married. Thomas Miller has expressed an interest. He is a good, steady man." Thomas Miller, a man twice her age, with dull eyes and a farm that was failing. The thought of it was like a caged door swinging shut. This was the life Jedediah envisioned for her, a wife, a housekeeper, a silent partner in a man's world. The cage was no longer a metaphor. It was a real and imminent threat. "I will not marry him," she said. The words were quiet, but they held the unyielding strength of desert rock. Jedediah scoffed. "You will do as you are told. You live under my roof. You will abide by my decisions." He turned and walked away. The matter settled in his mind. But in that moment, something shifted inside Nell. The brittle patience that the heat had baked into her bones finally snapped. She stood there for a long moment, the scent of dust and the coming night filling the air. She felt the weight of her mother's cross against her chest. A compass. It was time to choose a direction. She did not sleep that night, before the first hint of dawn painted the eastern sky. She was in the stable. She moved with a quiet, deliberate purpose, saddling her mare, a sturdy buckskin named Dust Devil. She packed a small bag with jerky, a canteen of water, and the old, folded letter from her uncle. She checked her handgun, ensuring it was loaded. As she led the mare out into the silent yard, a figure emerged from the shadows of the cantina. It was Rafaela, a shawl wrapped around her shoulders. "I heard you," she said simply. There was no judgment in her voice, only a deep and unwavering understanding. "You are going to the spring." Nell nodded, her throat too tight to speak. Rafaela pressed a small, cloth-wrapped bundle into her hands. "Coffee," she said, "and cornbread. The trail is long, and you should not face it on an empty stomach." She looked at Nell, her dark eyes searching. "There are men out there. Nell, Boone's men, and others. The land does not care if you are a man or a woman, but men do." "I know," Nell whispered, "but staying here is a different kind of danger." Rafaela squeezed her hand. "Be careful. They say only the Apache, men like Taza Nantan, can read that land, can understand its secrets. For the rest of us, it holds its own counsel." Nell had seen Taza Nantan in town a few times. He was a quiet man who moved with a grace that seemed out of place among the lumbering gaits of the cowboys and townsfolk. He was a trail guide, it was said, a man who understood the language of the wind and the rain. He was a ghost at the edge of their world, a reminder of the people who had been there long before the dust of San Miguel had ever settled. She mounted Dust Devil, the familiar feel of the saddle a small comfort. She looked down at her friend. "Thank you. Rafaela." "Go with God," Rafaela said softly. "Or at least, go with good aim," with a final nod. Nell turned her horse and rode out of town. The rising sun cast her long shadow before her as she headed toward the red rock mesas, toward the mouth of the canyon. She was riding away from the only home she had known, away from the future her stepfather had planned for her. But for the first time in a long time, she felt like she was riding toward herself. This was the first step, the first move out of the cage. The cool morning air felt like a promise on her skin, a promise of a life that would be, for better or worse, entirely her own. The sun was a molten coin slipping behind the jagged teeth of the western mesas when Nell finally reached the canyon's entrance. A profound quiet settled over the land, broken only by the tired sigh of her horse and the hum of insects in the dry brush. Before her, nestled in a grove of cottonwoods, was the spring. It was not a grand affair, just a pool of water, clear and still, bubbling up from the earth before trickling into a small creek that vanished into the rocks. The small, dilapidated cabin her uncle had mentioned stood nearby, its roof sagging but its walls still solid. A feeling of homecoming, sharp and unexpected, pierced through her exhaustion. This was hers, a place to begin. Her contentment was fleeting. As she dismounted and led Dust Devil toward the water, she saw the first sign of trouble, one of the stone boundary markers. A tall slab of sandstone her uncle had painstakingly set in place was toppled, lying half buried in the dust, a few yards away. Another was gone entirely. Her eyes scanned the ground. The story was written there in the red dirt, the deep ruts of a heavy wagon, and the distinct imprints of hobnailed boots. Boone's men. A cold anger, clean and hard, replaced the weariness in her bones. He had not even waited. He had simply come and begun to erase her claim as if she did not exist. She was examining the tracks, her hand resting on the butt of her pistol, when the world exploded in sound. The crack of a rifle shot echoed off the canyon walls, unnaturally loud in the evening stillness. A bullet whined past her head, striking a shower of stone chips from the rock face behind her. Instinct took over. Nell threw herself to the ground, pulling the mare's reins down with her, and scrambled behind a large boulder. Another shot answered the first, this one from deeper within the cottonwood grove near the spring. A man cursed loudly, his voice raw with pain. Peeking cautiously around the edge of her rock, Nell saw 3 men taking cover behind the wagon. They were firing toward the trees. Their target was a lone figure, moving with a fluid swiftness that made him difficult to track in the deepening twilight. He darted between the trees, a rifle in his hands, using the terrain with an intimacy that spoke of long familiarity. The fight was brief and brutal. The lone fighter was precise, his shots deliberate. One of the men by the wagon cried out and clutched his shoulder. Another's hat was sent spinning from his head. They were not expecting this kind of resistance. They were bullies and thugs, not seasoned fighters. With a volley of panicked, unaimed shots, they scrambled back into their wagon and whipped their team into a frantic gallop, disappearing back down the trail in a cloud of dust and curses. Silence descended once more, thicker and more menacing than before. Nell stayed where she was, her heart pounding against her ribs. She could hear the heavy breathing of her horse and the faint gurgle of the spring. Then, a figure emerged from the trees, walking slowly, his rifle held loosely at his side. He leaned heavily against a cottonwood, and even in the dim light, she could see the dark stain spreading across his left arm. It was the Apache man from town, Taza Nantan. She watched him for a long moment. He slid down the trunk of the tree to sit, his head bowed. He had saved her, whether he knew it or not. The bullet that had nearly hit her was surely meant for him. Hesitantly, she got to her feet, quieting her nervous horse with a soft word. She walked toward him, her steps slow and deliberate so as not to startle him. He looked up as she approached, his eyes dark and wary. His hand tightened on his rifle. "Are you one of Boone's people?" he asked, his voice a low rasp. Nell stopped a few feet away, her gaze falling to the wound on his arm. It was a shallow graze, but it was bleeding freely. "If I were," she said, her tone clipped and devoid of pleasantry, "I would have let you bleed and saved myself the trouble." His eyes held hers, searching. After a moment, some of the tension left his shoulders. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. Nell knelt beside him, untying the small bundle from her saddle. She took out a strip of clean cloth she kept for emergencies. Without asking permission, she gently took his arm. He flinched but did not pull away. She pressed the cloth firmly against the wound, the fabric quickly turning crimson. "It is not deep," she said, her voice all business, "but it needs to be cleaned." As she held the makeshift bandage in place, her gaze fell upon a leather satchel lying on the ground near where the wagon had been. It was a mail pouch, its flap unbuckled, its contents spilled onto the dirt. She saw a thick sheaf of papers and a rolled map tied with a ribbon. "They were stealing the mail," she said, more to herself than to him. Taza followed her gaze. "They were waiting for the courier. I was tracking a mountain lion and saw them. They were not interested in letters, only that bag." Nell moved to the pouch, her curiosity overriding her caution. She picked up the rolled map, unfurling it. She saw the familiar lines of the valley, but with a new, bold red line drawn across it. The line represented the proposed railroad track, and it ran directly through Hart's Spring. Beside the map lay a contract, its official seals gleaming in the last light of day. It was an agreement, signed by Silas Boone, to reroute the primary supply route for the railroad construction. The new route would make her Spring the exclusive watering stop for every freight wagon, every work crew, every military escort moving through the territory. He did not just want her water. He wanted to control the lifeblood of the entire operation. He needed to own this land. A grim understanding settled upon her. This was not a simple land grab. It was a calculated move for absolute power in the valley. She was still staring at the documents when the sound of approaching horses made her look up. 2 cowboys were riding toward them, their face grim in the twilight. They reined in their horses when they saw her, their eyes taking in the scene. Nell, an Anglo woman, kneeling on the ground next to a wounded Apache man. "Ma'am, you all right?" the older of the 2 asked, his hand drifting toward his sidearm. His eyes were hard as he looked at Taza. "What happened here?" "There was some trouble," Nell said, standing up slowly. "These men took care of it." She deliberately used the plural, including Taza in the resolution. The younger cowboy spat a stream of tobacco juice near Taza's feet. "Trouble follows his kind," he said, his voice dripping with contempt. "What is a decent woman like you doing out here with him?" Taza remained silent, his expression unmoving, as if carved from the same red rock as the mesas. He seemed to have retreated to a place where their words could not reach him. But Nell felt a hot flash of anger. She had no patience for this brand of willful ignorance. "He is wounded because he drove off the men who were shooting at me," she said, her voice dangerously calm. "And as for what I am doing here, I am on my own property. Now, unless you plan on offering some help, I suggest you ride on." The men exchanged a look, a mixture of surprise and resentment. They were not used to being spoken to this way by a woman. The older one grunted, "Have it your way, ma'am." He gave Taza one last venomous glare before pulling on his reins. "Just be careful of the company you keep." They kicked their horses into a trot and disappeared down the trail, leaving an air of sour hostility behind them. Nell turned back to Taza. The silence stretched between them, filled with the unspoken weight of the encounter. "Thank you," she said finally. He looked at her, truly looked at her. For the first time, "You did not need to speak for me." "I know," she said, "but I wanted to." He pushed himself to his feet, wincing as he put weight on his arm. Night was falling quickly now, the sky a deep, star-filled indigo. The air was growing cooler, and a strange scent was on the wind, the smell of dust and distant rain. "A storm is coming," he said, looking at the sky. "The trail back to town will be treacherous in the dark." He paused. "There is another way, a path through the canyon. It is safer." It was not an offer of friendship, but a statement of practical necessity. They were 2 people caught in the same predicament, their paths now tangled by Boone's ambition. They were, for now, allies. "I would be grateful," she said. He nodded, then began gathering the scattered mail, his movements efficient despite his injury. He packed everything back into the leather satchel. He would see it returned to the proper authorities. Nell went to her horse and gathered her things. As they prepared to leave, Nell looked around at the small piece of land that was hers. Her uncle's words echoed in her mind. A piece of land that is truly yours is the closest thing to freedom. She now understood that freedom was not something that was given. It was something that had to be fought for, defended. The toppled markers, the stolen mail, the gunshots in the twilight, they were Boone's declaration of war. And looking at the quiet, resilient man standing beside her, she realized she had just found her first and most unlikely soldier. She had 1 week, maybe less. If she did not find a way to reclaim what was legally hers, to expose Boone's scheme and reassert her ownership, Heart Spring would be lost forever. The cage she had just escaped would be replaced by a battle she could not afford to lose. The journey back to San Miguel was a silent one, each rider lost in their own thoughts, the clop of their horses' hooves a lonely rhythm in the pre-dawn dark. Taza moved with an unerring sense of direction, navigating the treacherous canyon path as if it were a familiar room in his own home. By the time the first pale light of morning touched the sky, they were on the outskirts of the town. Taza paused where the trail met the main road. "The mail pouch must go to Earl at the post office," he said. His voice was low. "Matter of fact, the papers are your concern." He handed her the satchel, his fingers brushing hers for a fleeting second. Then, with a nod that was both a farewell and an acknowledgement of their shared predicament, he guided his horse into the brush, vanishing as silently as he had appeared. Nell rode into town, feeling as though a lifetime had passed since she had left. The town was just stirring, the air filled with the smells of wood smoke and brewing coffee. She went first to the post office, a small shack next to the general store. Earl, the postmaster, a man with a perpetually worried expression and ink stains on his fingers, was just opening up. She handed him the satchel. "I found this out near the canyon," she said, offering no further explanation. Earl's eyes widened as he saw the familiar pouch. He checked the contents, his hands trembling slightly. "It is all here. Thank heavens. The courier never arrived." "We feared the Red Butte gang had gotten him." He looked at her, his expression a mixture of relief and curiosity, but he did not ask any more questions. In San Miguel, people learned not to ask about things that were found in the desert at dawn. Her next stop was the office of Judge Elias Miller. It was a small, dusty room in the back of the land registry, smelling of old paper and stale tobacco. The judge was an elderly man, his face a roadmap of weary concern. He peered at Nell over his spectacles as she laid her uncle's deed on his desk. "This is my claim to Heart Spring." "Judge," she said, her voice steady, "the boundary markers have been torn down, and men working for Silas Boone have been on my land." The judge sighed, a long, weary sound. He studied the deed, his finger tracing the faded signature of the territorial clerk. "This seems to be in order. Eleanor, your Uncle Thomas was a good man, if a bit of a wanderer." As if on cue, the door opened and Silas Boone walked in. He was freshly shaved, his suit immaculate despite the early hour. Deputy Kincaid slouched in behind him, his presence filling the small room with the faint odor of whiskey. "Good morning, Judge," Boone said, his voice as smooth as polished stone. He nodded to Nell. "Miss Hart, I trust you slept well." The insinuation was clear, a veiled reference to her night spent away from town. "I have business with the judge, Mr. Boone," she said, ignoring his jibe. "As do I," he replied, placing a document on the desk next to her deed. It was embossed with the seal of the railroad company, a discretionary requisition order. "The United States government has granted our railroad certain privileges to ensure the timely completion of this vital artery of commerce. For security and logistical purposes, we are temporarily requisitioning the land and water source at the mouth of the North Canyon." Judge Miller picked up the paper, his brow furrowed. The language was dense and filled with legal jargon, but its meaning was clear. It was a license to take whatever he wanted. "This is highly irregular. Silas, the Hart property is a private claim. A temporary measure." "Judge," Boone said with his empty smile, "for the public good. We cannot have our supply lines threatened." "Threatened by whom Nell demanded. I am the owner. I pose no threat." Deputy Kincaid spoke for the first time, his voice a gravelly slur. "There is Apache activity in that canyon. Missy, the railroad cannot take risks. It is a matter of safety." He looked pointedly at Nell, and she knew he was not talking about a general threat. He was talking about Taza. News in a town this small traveled faster than a prairie fire. "This paper is a sham," Nell said, her voice shaking with suppressed fury. "It is a license for theft." The judge looked from the deed to the requisition order, then at the confident face of Boone and the menacing slouch of his deputy. He was a man caught in a vice. I will need time to look into this, to consult the territorial statutes." "Of course. Judge," Boone said smoothly, "take all the time you need. In the meantime, my men will secure the area, for everyone's protection." He tipped his hat and walked out, leaving Nell standing in the silent, dusty room. She had presented the law, and he had countered with power. And in the Arizona territory, she was beginning to understand that the two were not always on the same side. She found her way to Rafaela's cantina. The story of her confrontation at the judge's office had already made its way through the town's invisible network of gossip. Rafaela placed a cup of strong, black coffee in front of her. "So the snake shows his fangs," Rafaela said, her arms crossed over her chest. "He did not even have the decency to call it a purchase," Nell said, wrapping her cold hands around the warm cup. "He just called it a requisition, as if my land were nothing more than a sack of flour for his pantry." Mr. Grady, the blacksmith, a man with arms as thick as tree limbs, came in for his morning coffee. He nodded to Nell, his expression grim. "I heard, do not let him bully you, girl. A man's right to his property is sacred. A woman's, too." The sentiment was heartening, but Nell knew it was not enough. The town was dividing itself into cautious camps. The Anglo freighters and teamsters who worked for Boone grumbled about her, seeing her as an obstacle to their wages. But the small Mexican ranchers, the rancheros who had been squeezed by Boone's land acquisitions for months, saw her as a symbol of resistance. They had been forced to pay exorbitant prices for grazing rights and access to water. In her fight, they saw a glimmer of hope for their own. Later that day, Nell rode back out to the spring. She had to reestablish her claim, to make a physical statement that she would not be erased. She brought a shovel and heavy wooden stakes, determined to rebuild her boundary markers. As she was digging a hole for the first stake, she felt a presence behind her. She turned, her hand going to her pistol, and saw Taza emerge from the cottonwoods. He had cleaned and bound his wound. He watched her for a moment, his dark eyes taking in the heavy stake and the hole she was struggling to dig in the hard, rocky soil. "That is not where the water runs," he said, his voice quiet. He walked over and pointed to a spot a few feet to the left. "Here, the ground is deeper. In the wet season, the creek will flow on this side. It will wash your post away where you are digging now." He then showed her how to read the subtle contours of the land, the lines of erosion and the types of plants that indicated deep soil or shallow rock. He taught her how to gauge the level of the water in the spring by observing the color of the stones at its edge, a skill that would tell her how much water she could spare during the dry months. As they worked, a strange sort of comfort settled between them. They spoke little, but their shared purpose was a language of its own. "Why are you helping me?" she asked, looking up from her work. He did not answer immediately. He was scanning the horizon, his gaze distant. "Boone's railroad will not stop at your spring. My people have seen these iron tracks before. They cut the land in two. They scare the game away. They change everything." He looked at her. "You are fighting for a piece of paper, a deed. I am fighting for the land itself." "It is more than a piece of paper," she said, her voice rising with a passion she did not know she possessed. "It is my freedom, the right to make my own choices, to build my own life." A faint, ironic smile touched his lips. "Your freedom is to choose. My freedom is to be left alone. They are not the same thing." The conversation lingered in her mind long after he had gone. She understood what he meant. Her ambition was to possess and to build. His was to exist in harmony with what was already there. Yet, here they were, fighting the same battle. The tension in San Miguel grew thicker with each passing day. The air itself felt different, charged and heavy. Taza had warned her of it. He had stopped her on the trail one afternoon, pointing to the sky. "The light is wrong," he had said. "A sandstorm is coming. A bad one. Reinforce your shelters, and keep wet cloths ready to cover your face. Tell your friend to do the same." Nell took his warning seriously. She and Rafaela spent an afternoon securing the shutters on the cantina and reinforcing the small corral behind it. People watched them, some with amusement, others with a dawning unemployment. The storm, when it came, was a monster. But the fire came first. That night, a malevolent orange glow lit up the sky in the direction of the canyon. Nell Rafaela's voice was a sharp cry in the darkness. They did not need to speak. They both knew what it was. They ran to the stable and rode out of town as if the devil himself were on their heels. The new boundary posts Nell had so painstakingly set were ablaze, the flames licking at the dry wood, a deliberate act of destruction. They beat at the fire with saddle blankets, their lungs filling with acrid smoke. The flames were stubborn, but they were small. It was a message, not an inferno. Finally, the last ember was extinguished. They stood, coughing and covered in soot, in the ruin of Nell's hard work. As she caught her breath, her boot struck something metallic in the churned-up sand. She bent down and picked it up. It was a small, silver star, tarnished and caked with dirt, the badge of a deputy sheriff. She stared at it in her palm, the piece of metal feeling as heavy as a death sentence. It was not just Boone's faceless thugs she was fighting anymore. The law in San Miguel had chosen its side, and it was not hers. Nell held the deputy's tarnished badge in her palm all the way back to town. The weight of it a cold, hard knot of truth. The world was still dark, but the air had changed. It was thick, heavy, and carried a peculiar metallic scent. The wind had ceased its gentle sighing and was now holding its breath, a tense and ominous stillness that precedes violence. Taza's warning about a sandstorm echoed in her mind, no longer a prediction but a coming certainty. By mid-morning, the sky began to bleed its color. The brilliant blue faded to a pale, sickly yellow, then to a bruised, brassy orange. The wind rose with a low moan that grew into a piercing shriek, a sound that seemed to tear at the very fabric of the air. It picked up the fine red dust and threw it into the sky, creating a roiling, suffocating curtain that blotted out the sun. Doors and shutters slammed across San Miguel. The world shrank to the space of a few feet, and then to nothing at all. The storm was a physical assault. Sand, as fine as flour, worked its way into everything. It gritted between the teeth, stung the eyes, and coated the back of the throat with a dry, rasping film. The wind howled like a legion of tormented souls, its force shaking the wooden buildings to their foundations. Through the maelstrom, another sound became faintly audible, a desperate cry for help, quickly shredded by the gale. Nell, who had taken refuge in Rafaela's cantina, exchanged a look with her friend. They tied wet cloths over their noses and mouths and peered out the door. Through a momentary lull in the blinding dust, they saw a wagon, its rear wheel shattered, stranded in the middle of the street. A small group of people, a family of Mexican ranchers she recognized, were huddled against it, their bodies bent against the onslaught. A child was crying, a thin, terrified wail that was almost lost in the wind's roar. Before Nell could even formulate a plan, a figure materialized out of the swirling red chaos. It was Taza. He moved with a low, steady purpose. His body angled against the wind. He carried a coil of rope and a soaked blanket. He reached the stranded family, shouting instructions that Nell could not hear but understood from his gestures. He wrapped the wet blanket around the mother and the smallest child, then tied one end of the rope to the broken wagon and the other around his own waist. He was creating a lifeline, a guide through the blinding storm toward the most solid structure nearby, Mr. Grady's blacksmith shop, built of thick adobe and stone. Nell did not hesitate. Tearing a strip from a tablecloth, she soaked it in a water bucket and tied it around her own face. She grabbed her heavy wool cloak from its peg and ran out into the storm. The force of the wind nearly knocked her off her feet, the sand scouring her exposed skin. She fought her way to the wagon, reaching the family just as Taza was leading the first of them along the rope. She saw a young boy, no older than 7, his face pale with terror. Without a word, she wrapped her own cloak around him, pulling the hood up to shield his face from the stinging sand. She took his small hand, placing it firmly on the rope. "Hold on!" she shouted, her voice swallowed by the wind. "Do not let go!" One by one, they guided the family to the blacksmith's forge. Taza seemed to know the currents of the wind itself, positioning them in the lee of the building where the force was weakest. They huddled inside, the roaring of the storm slightly muffled by the thick walls, the air tasting of coal dust and fear. They were a small, strange collection of humanity: the Mexican family, the Anglo blacksmith, the Apache guide, and the woman who was fighting for a piece of land. In the face of the storm's impartial fury, the petty divisions of their world seemed to dissolve into the red dust that covered them all. The sandstorm raged for the rest of the day and into the night. When morning came, it was to a world transformed. The wind was gone, and a profound, ringing silence had taken its place. The town was buried. Sand was drifted like snow against buildings, in some places reaching halfway up the doors. The sky was a hazy, washed-out blue, the sun a pale, distant wafer. As the people of San Miguel began to dig themselves out, Silas Boone made his move. He did not use guns or threats. He used paper and ink. A notice, printed in bold, black letters, was nailed to the door of the church, the one place everyone in town would eventually pass. It read, "By the authority of the Territorial Railroad Commission, and in the interest of public safety and the common good. The water source, known as Hart Spring, is hereby temporarily requisitioned. All access will be controlled by railroad agents to ensure the secure and orderly progress of this vital infrastructure." It was a masterful stroke of predatory timing. The town was battered, exhausted, and focused on survival. The notice was a declaration of ownership, posted on the most sacred door in town, cloaked in the righteous language of progress and security. Nell felt a cold, hard fury solidify in her gut. She went to see Judge Miller, who looked even more weary than before. He had seen the notice. "My hands are tied, Eleanor," he said, gesturing to a stack of papers on his desk. "Boone's requisition order, for all its bluster, has a veneer of legality. I have sent a wire to the territorial capital for clarification on the statutes he is citing. But the mail courier carrying the official land claim verifications from the county seat, he never arrived. Without those papers to corroborate your deed, my authority is limited." Something in the way he said it, a note of frustrated resignation, sparked a connection in Nell's mind. The courier who never arrived. The mail pouch stolen by Boone's men. Her heart began to beat a little faster. She left the judge's office and went to find Earl at the post office. The small building was a mess, sand covering every surface. Earl was sweeping half-heartedly. His shoulders slumped. He looked up when she came in, and a flicker of something guilt crossed his face. "Earl," she said, her voice low and direct. "The judge is waiting for papers. From the county seat. They were on the mail run that went missing." Earl stopped sweeping. He would not meet her eyes. I do not know anything about that. Nell, do not lie to me," she said, her voice still quiet but now edged with steel. "I was there. I saw the mail pouch. I saw what Boone's men took from it. And I know the rest of the mail was returned. So why are the judge's papers still missing?" The postmaster's face crumpled. He leaned against the counter, his whole body seeming to shrink. He made the switch on the previous run. He whispered, his voice choked with shame. "Boone, he paid the courier, a man named Henderson, to swap the official pouch with a dummy. The papers the judge is waiting for, they were never on that last ride. Kincaid picked them up himself from Henderson at the Redwash relay station 2 days ago. Redwash, the name hung in the air. It was a remote outpost, a full day's ride into the Badlands, a place where a man like Kincaid could operate without fear of witnesses. "Thank you, Earl," she said. The anger she felt toward him was eclipsed by a cold, clear sense of purpose. He was a small, frightened man, caught in a big man's game. Her fight was not with him. She found Taza at the edge of town, observing the sky. He seemed to be reading the aftermath of the storm in the clouds, in the way the light fell upon the land. She walked up to him, the deputy's badge still heavy in her pocket. "I know where the papers are," she said without preamble. "They are at Red Wash. Kincaid has them." He turned to look at her, his expression unreadable. He considered her words, his gaze sweeping over her, noting the determined set of her jaw and the exhaustion that still lingered in her eyes. "Red Wash is a hard place," he said. "Boone keeps men there. The road is not for the faint of heart." Nell met his gaze without flinching. A dry, humorless smile touched her lips. "I am not faint," she said, her voice clear and strong. "I am thirsty." A flicker of understanding, perhaps even respect, passed through his dark eyes. He gave a single, decisive nod. That evening, the three of them gathered in the back room of Rafaela's cantina. Taza drew a map in the dust on the floor with a stick, his movements economical and precise. "We cannot take the main trail. They will see us coming for miles. We will leave after moonset. Cross the creek here, where the banks are low. Then through the Saguaro Hills. There is a pass through the rocks here that will bring us up behind the station." Rafaela listened intently, her face grim. While Taza planned the route, she was planning for their survival. She filled a canteen with water and another with coffee, boiled thick and strong enough to fortify a man against his own fear. She wrapped a stack of cornbread and dried meat in a cloth. Her support was not in words, but in these practical acts of loyalty and care. As Nell was preparing to leave, a figure stepped out of the deep shadows near the church. It was Father Deacon, his cassock a black silhouette against the starlit sky. He held a folded piece of paper in his hand. "I heard you were riding out," he said, his voice a quiet rumble. He did not ask where or why. He simply understood that a line had been crossed. Judge Miller can only fight with the laws of men, which can be bent and broken, but there are other truths. He pressed the paper into her hand. She unfolded it and saw the elegant, looping script of a parish priest from a lifetime ago. It was a copy of her baptismal certificate. Her name, Eleanor Hart, was written in the center, a testament to her existence, her identity, an irrefutable fact that predated any deed or claim. "It is just another piece of paper," Father Deacon said softly. "But it is a reminder that the law also has a human face, that you are not just a name on a deed. You are a child of God, and you have a right to be here." Nell looked down at the paper, then back at the old priest. His simple act of faith was a more powerful blessing than any prayer. She tucked the certificate safely into her shirt pocket, its crisp edges a tangible comfort against her skin. It was a different kind of deed, a claim not to land, but to her own humanity. With a final nod to Rafaela, she mounted her horse and followed Taza into the moonless night, leaving the wounded, sleeping town behind them. The world beyond San Miguel was a place of profound silence, a landscape carved from shadow and starlight. They rode for hours without speaking, Taza leading them on a path that was invisible to Nell. It was a trail that existed not on any map, but in his understanding of the earth itself. He guided them through a maze of colossal saguaros that stood like silent, multi-armed sentinels in the darkness. Then into a narrow defile where the air grew cool and smelled of damp stone. Nell's initial fear of the unknown slowly gave way to a grudging admiration. He moved through this formidable landscape with a quiet confidence that was more reassuring than any spoken promise. Her body ached with a weariness that went bone deep. Every muscle protested, and the grit from the sandstorm felt like a permanent part of her skin, a rough and irritating second layer. Just when she felt she could not ride a moment longer, Taza reined in his horse. They had emerged into a small, hidden basin, a secret fold in the land protected on all sides by sheer rock walls. In the center of the basin, a copse of ancient cottonwood trees grew, their leaves whispering in the faint night breeze. And through the trees, she heard the most beautiful sound in the world, the gentle murmur of moving water. Taza dismounted. "We will rest here until the moon rises," he said. "The horses need water, and so do we." Nell practically fell from her saddle, her legs unsteady beneath her. She led Dust Devil to the source of the sound, a narrow creek that flowed over smooth, pale stones. The water was clear and impossibly cold. In the absolute darkness of the basin, shielded from any ambient light from the distant plains, the sky was a revelation. It was a vast, deep bowl of black velvet, so densely packed with stars that they seemed to be spilling across the heavens, their light a brilliant, silver dust that illuminated the landscape in a soft, ethereal glow. The creek reflected this celestial fire, its surface a flowing river of captured starlight. For a long moment, Nell just stood there, mesmerized. Then, a deep and urgent need overtook her. She knelt by the water's edge, unfastened the wet cloth from her face, and plunged her hands into the creek. The cold was a shocking, welcome relief. She splashed the water onto her face, scrubbing away the layers of dust and grime. She cupped her hands and drank, the water clean and sweet, a taste of life itself. She unpinned her hair, letting it fall, and dipped it into the stream, washing away the grit that had matted its strands. It felt like more than a simple washing. With each splash, she felt as though she were rinsing away the suffocating dust of San Miguel, the memory of her stepfather's hard gaze, the oily residue of Boone's smile. She was shedding a skin, a life that had been defined for her by others. Here, in this hidden place, under this immense and silent sky, she felt utterly and completely alone, and for the first time, the feeling was not frightening. It was liberating. She sat back on her heels, her wet hair clinging to her shoulders, and looked up at the canopy of brilliant stars. A single, quiet thought rose in her mind, and she spoke it aloud, her voice little more than a whisper in the vast stillness. I never thought my first night of freedom would belong to this Apache sky. Taza was a few yards away, tending to the horses. He heard her, his head turning in the starlight. He walked over and stood near the creek's edge. Not too close, leaving a respectful space between them. It only belongs to it if you wish, he said, his voice a low counterpoint to the sound of the water. His expression was serious, yet there was a hint of something else in his eyes, a kind of gentle irony. Out here, nothing owns you but your own choices. His words struck her with the force of a revelation. That was the difference. In San Miguel, her life was a series of reactions to the choices of others. Here, the path ahead was terrifying and uncertain, but the decision to take it had been hers alone. The water, the stars, the very air she was breathing felt different because of it. A comfortable silence fell between them. They were two solitary figures in a vast landscape, yet she did not feel threatened by his presence. He had a stillness about him, a way of occupying a space without dominating it. Tell me about the rain paths, she said, remembering the phrase he had used. He looked up at the sky, as if the answer were written there among the constellations. It is not a story for words, he said after a moment. It is a feeling the land breathes. In the dry season, it takes a long, slow breath. It waits before a storm. You can feel it begin to breathe out. The air changes. The plants release a different scent. The animals move in a certain way. The rain does not just fall anywhere. It follows the old paths, the low places, the lines of thirst in the earth. To know the paths is to know where to be when the life-giving water comes. She listened, captivated. He was not just describing the weather. He was describing a relationship, an intimate conversation with the world. Where I grew up, back east, she said, her own voice softer now, we did not have rain paths. We had the sea. I remember the smell of it, especially before a storm. Salty and wet and full of something wild. It smelled like the edge of the world. She had not thought of that smell in years. The memory felt like a message from a ghost, a girl she had once been, a lifetime ago. He nodded slowly, a silent acknowledgement of her shared confidence. This was how trust was built. She realized, not in grand gestures, but in these small, quiet exchanges of truth. She felt a sudden, unaccustomed lightness. The exhaustion was still there, a deep thrumming in her bones, but it was overlaid with a sense of possibility she had never known. Feeling a bit unsteady, she tried to push herself to her feet, but her boot slipped on a wet, mossy stone. She flailed for a moment, a small, undignified gasp escaping her lips. Instantly, Taza's hand was there, his grip firm and steady on her arm, preventing her from tumbling back into the creek. He held her just long enough for her to regain her balance, then released her. His touch was impersonal, a simple, practical act of assistance. Yet the brief contact sent a surprising warmth through her. She looked at him, expecting to see a flicker of amusement in his eyes. His face was perfectly solemn. A genuine smile, the first she had felt in days, touched her lips. "If you laugh," she said, her voice laced with mock severity, "I will make you fetch my hat, and I will make sure it falls on the other side of the creek." For the first time, she saw the corners of his mouth twitch, a fleeting ghost of a smile. "Your hat is on your head," he pointed out. "It is the principle of the thing," she retorted, and the quiet sound of her own laughter felt strange and wonderful in the silent basin. The light-hearted moment passed, but it left a change in the air between them. The last of the tension had gone, replaced by a nascent and fragile ease. They were on their way to a dangerous place, to a confrontation that could very well cost them their lives. The thought sent a cold shiver through her. "I am afraid," she said, the admission costing her a great deal of pride. He did not offer false comfort or tell her she had no reason to be. He simply looked at her and said, "To be afraid is to be alive. It is what you do with the fear that matters." "Then we should agree on what we will do," she said, her mind suddenly clear. This was a partnership, not a rescue. It needed rules. We need to make some rules for this journey. He considered her, his gaze steady and serious. "What rules?" "First," she said, thinking of her confession and his response, "we tell the truth when we are afraid. It is better than pretending." He nodded. "That is a good rule." "Second," she continued, thinking of her stepfather and Boone, of all the men who had tried to chart her course for her, "we do not make decisions for the other person. We decide together, or we each decide for ourselves." "Agreed," he said without hesitation. "And third," she paused, her hand unconsciously drifting to the butt of her pistol, "we do not shoot unless it is to protect a life, not property, not papers, a life. That is the only rule that has ever mattered," he said quietly. They had forged a pact, a small constitution for their desperate, two-person republic. In that moment, looking at him in the starlight, she felt a connection that had nothing to do with gratitude or need. It was based on something far more solid: respect. He saw her not as a helpless woman or a stubborn girl, but as a partner. And she saw him not as a mysterious savage or a silent guide, but as a man of deep and quiet wisdom. "You read the land well?" he said, his voice breaking the silence. It was a simple statement of fact, but she heard the praise contained within it. "You listen to the wind well," she replied, and the symmetry of their words felt like a promise. A sound from the high canyon rim cut through the night, a long, mournful howl that was both beautiful and chilling. A wolf. It was a reminder of the wilderness that surrounded them, of the dangers, both animal and human, that lay in wait. Instantly, the quiet moment of peace was over. They moved with a shared, unspoken urgency. Taza scattered the small, smokeless fire he had built, burying its embers with dirt. Nell saddled Dust Devil, her movements swift and efficient. The fragile trust that had been born by the creek had now solidified, tempered by the reality of their mission. They were ready. They mounted their horses and, without a backward glance at the secret, starlit sanctuary, rode out of the basin and back into the dangerous, waiting night. The path Taza had chosen brought them to a high ridge overlooking the Red Wash relay station. It was less a settlement and more a scar on the land. A collection of ramshackle buildings huddled around a dusty corral and a deep well. A single lantern hung on a post in the center of the yard, casting long, dancing shadows that made the place seem alive with furtive movement. They dismounted in a cluster of rocks, keeping the horses out of sight. From their vantage point, they could see everything. They lay on their bellies, the rough stone pressing into them, and watched. Taza had taught Nell what to look for, not the obvious things, but the rhythms. The way a guard on patrol would pause at the same spot on each circuit. The length of time between the clink of a bottle from the main cabin and a burst of rough laughter. The nervous flick of a horse's ear in the corral. A sign of some disturbance too subtle for human senses. They counted 4 men, including the lumbering form of Deputy Kincaid. Taza took a handful of the fine red dust and rubbed it on his palms, then streaked it across his face, the dark red clay blending with his skin until he was a part of the earth itself. Nell followed his example, the grit feeling cool against her warm skin. It was a strange sort of baptism, a preparation for a battle that would be won not with thunder but with whispers. "The largest building is the warehouse and office," she whispered, her voice barely a breath of sound. "The papers must be in there." "The guards change in 1 hour," Taza replied, his eyes never leaving the station. "The new man will be sleepy. That is your time. I will be on the east side, near the hayricks, if there is trouble. I will make a sound." The hour crept by with agonizing slowness. Finally, they saw the guard switch, one man stumbling back to the bunkhouse while another took his place, his shoulders already slumped with boredom. It was time. Nell gave Taza a final, sharp nod, and then she was gone, a shadow detaching itself from the deeper shadows of the rocks. She moved with a slow, deliberate grace she did not know she possessed, placing each foot carefully, her senses screamingly alive. The crunch of gravel under her boot sounded as loud as a gunshot to her own ears. She reached the dark side of the warehouse, her back pressed against the rough, splintery wood, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. The main door was thick, with a heavy iron lock. It was impossible. She crept along the wall to a smaller side door, its hinges rusted. It, too, was locked. A wave of despair washed over her. Then, she saw a faint line of light under the door. Someone was inside. She froze, every muscle tensed. The door creaked open, and a figure holding a small, shielded lantern stepped out. Nell flattened herself against the wall, her hand on her pistol, but the man did not look her way. He glanced nervously around the yard, then hurried away toward the outhouse. It was Earl, the postmaster. Before she could process what was happening, he was on his way back. He saw her then, a dark shape against the wall, and a small, terrified squeak escaped his lips. She put a finger to her own lips, a silent plea. His eyes were wide with fear, but he did not shout. He motioned her inside, closing the door behind them. The warehouse smelled of dust, oats, and machine oil. In the center of the room was a heavy wooden desk, and on it, an open strongbox. "I could not live with it," Earl whispered, his whole body trembling. "Kincaid told me to come out here and burn the originals. He said Boone wanted every trace gone, but I could not do it. It is one thing to be a coward. Nell, it is another to set fire to the truth." He held out a small, ornate key. "The mailbag is in the box. I was trying to work up the nerve to take it when I heard you." A surge of gratitude and pity for the small, terrified man filled her. He had chosen to do the right thing, at the worst possible time, at the greatest possible risk. "Get out of here, Earl," she said, taking the key. "Ride. Do not go back to town. Just go." He nodded, his face a mask of miserable relief, and slipped out the door, vanishing into the night. Nell turned to the strongbox. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely fit the key into the lock. It turned with a satisfying click. She reached inside and pulled out the leather mail pouch, its flap stamped with the official seal of the county. She had it. A giddy sense of triumph flooded through her. The main door of the warehouse crashed open. Deputy Kincaid stood there, framed in the yellow lantern light from the yard, a look of pure fury on his face. Behind him, two of Boone's hired guns raised their rifles. Well, Kincaid slurred, a malevolent grin spreading across his face. Look what the cat dragged in. I knew that sniveling postmaster had no spine. Nell was frozen, the mailbag clutched in her hand like a useless shield. A rifle shot cracked from the ridge, and a splinter of wood flew from the door frame next to Kincaid's head. Taza's warning shot. Kincaid and his men ducked back, firing blindly into the darkness. "Get him!" Kincaid roared. One of the men ran outside, while the other advanced on Nell, his pistol leveled. She was shoved into a chair, her hands yanked behind her back, the rough bite of rope scraping her wrists. The mail pouch was torn from her grasp and thrown onto the desk. Kincaid loomed over her, his breath a foul wave of cheap whiskey. "You have caused me a great deal of trouble, Miss Hart, a great deal. I had a nice, quiet arrangement here, but you and your redskin friend had to stick your noses in it." He picked up the mailbag. "Boone pays well, better than a deputy's salary, and he does not care if a man has a few debts from the card table." He tossed the bag to the remaining guard, a young man with nervous eyes. "Tie her up good and tight. We will deal with her when we have taken care of her friend in the rocks." As the young guard began to bind her to the chair, a wave of pure, cold panic washed over Nell. Her breath hitched. The room seemed to tilt, the lantern light blurring. This was it. This was how it ended. The rule: tell the truth when you are afraid. The words from the creek, from that other lifetime, came back to her. Her voice was a choked, broken whisper. "I am so scared." The young guard's hands faltered. He looked at her, and for a second, the hard mask of the hired gun slipped, revealing a boy not much older than herself. He saw not a threat, not an obstacle, but a terrified young woman. His eyes darted toward Kincaid, who was now shouting orders into the yard. When he turned back to his task, his movements were less sure. The final knot he tied was clumsy, leaving a fraction of an inch of slack. Suddenly, a new light bloomed outside, an angry, orange glare that flickered against the windows. Shouts of alarm rose from the yard. Taza had circled around in the darkness and set fire to a massive pile of dry hay and tumbleweeds stacked against the corral. Fanned by the night wind, the fire roared to life, a wall of smoke and embers sweeping toward the main buildings. The distraction was total. Kincaid cursed and ran outside. The young guard, his face pale, hesitated for a moment, then ran after him. Nell was alone. She twisted her wrists against the ropes, the rough fibers tearing at her skin. The slack the boy had left was just enough. With a surge of desperate strength, she pulled one hand free. She untied the rest of the knots, her fingers clumsy and raw. She grabbed the mailbag from the desk and ran for the side door. The yard was chaos. Men were running with buckets, their figures silhouetted against the raging fire. The smoke was thick, acrid, and blinding. She held her breath and plunged into it, heading for the stables. She reached the stable doors and threw them open. The horses inside were screaming, their eyes wide with terror. She unlatched the corral gate, slapping the nearest horse on the rump. The animal bolted, and the rest followed. A thundering herd of panicked horseflesh that added to the mayhem. A figure burst through the smoke, bellowing her name. It was Kincaid. He lunged for her, his face a mask of rage. He was not a skilled gunman, just a bully with a badge, and in his fury, he was clumsy. He tripped on a loose threshold stone, his feet tangling, and went sprawling in the dirt. His pistol flew from his grasp, landing in the dust a few feet away. For a heartbeat, the world stood still. The gun lay between them. Her own pistol was still holstered at her side. She could end this right here. The third rule: protect a life, not property, not papers. She took a step forward and kicked Kincaid's pistol with all her might. It spun away into the darkness, lost in the churned-up dirt. Kincaid roared and scrambled to his feet, lunging for her. She sidestepped him, grabbing a long leather rein that hung from a peg. As he stumbled past, she whipped it around his ankles. Pulling tight, he crashed to the ground, and before he could recover, she was on him, using the rest of the rein to bind his hands behind his back. Nell, now. Taza was there, his form appearing like a ghost out of the smoke. He grabbed her arm, pulling her away from the trussed and cursing deputy. They ran, not toward the open plains, but toward a deep, dry drainage ditch that ran behind the stables. As they scrambled down the embankment, a bullet sang past Taza's ear, and he grunted in pain. They half slid, half fell to the bottom of the gully, and ran, crouched low, until the sounds of shouting and the roar of the fire faded behind them. They did not stop until they were a mile away, hidden in a deep arroyo. The glow from the fire at Red Wash stained the horizon like a false dawn. Taza leaned against the rock wall, his breath coming in ragged gasps. She saw the fresh, dark tear in his other shirt sleeve, the blood welling up from a new graze on his right arm. Without a word, she tore another strip of cloth from her petticoat. The fire was too far away to provide any useful ash, so she simply pressed the cloth to the wound. A clean, direct pressure. He did not flinch, but she could feel the tension in his muscles. They had the papers. They had won the battle. But she could feel the weight of what was to come settling upon them. Boone would not take this loss quietly. He would unleash a greater storm than any the desert could produce. This victory was not an ending. It was a turning point, and the road ahead had just become infinitely more dangerous. They rode back into San Miguel under the full light of a new day, looking less like returning heroes and more like weary ghosts. They were covered in dust and soot, their face drawn with exhaustion, but in Nell's hands, clutched tightly, was the stolen mail pouch. This time, there was no sneaking in. They rode straight down the main street, a silent, defiant procession of two. People stopped and stared, their morning greetings dying on their lips. Nell went directly to the judge's office, Taza walking beside her until they reached the door. He stopped there, a silent guardian. "This is your battle now," he said. "You have the weapons." He then melted back into the shadows of the town, leaving her to fight the war of paper and words. Judge Miller looked up as she entered, his expression shifting from weary surprise to astonishment as she placed the official mail pouch on his desk. "My God, child," he breathed. "Where did you get this?" "Where Deputy Kincaid left it," she said simply, and laid out the entire story, her voice low and steady. She presented the stolen land claim verifications, the fraudulent railroad contracts, the rerouted map. It was a story of conspiracy and theft, sealed and certified by the county itself. As she spoke, others began to filter into the small office, drawn by the news that was now sweeping through the town. Father Deacon arrived first, his presence a quiet bulwark of moral authority. "I will stand as a witness to this young woman's character," he announced, his voice filling the room. "Mr." Grady the blacksmith came next, his large frame crowding the doorway. He was followed by a half-dozen other small ranchers and teamsters, men who had been bullied and cheated by Boone. "We have had enough of Boone's brand of progress," Grady said, his voice a low rumble. He produced a piece of paper, a petition signed by 20 men, attesting to Boone's strong-arm tactics and demanding a fair hearing on the matter of the spring. The law, which had seemed so flimsy and distant, was finally beginning to gather its strength in this small, dusty room. But Boone's power was not confined to legal documents. While Nell fought with paper, Rafaela was sharpening a different kind of pen. She had written a letter, not to the territorial government, which moved with the speed of a dying glacier, but to the editor of the Tucson Sentinel, Her letter was not a plea for sympathy. It was a clear, concise account of a railroad contractor using fraudulent papers and armed intimidation to seize a vital water source from its legal owner. She framed it as a story of corporate overreach, a threat to the rights of every small landowner in the territory. It was a shrewd and powerful argument, appealing not to pity, but to the fierce, independent spirit of the West and its deep-seated suspicion of powerful outside interests. She sent it off with a freight driver that very morning. Boone, however, was not a man to be outmaneuvered. He responded not by defending himself, but by attacking. The next morning, a new notice appeared. This one not only on the church door but on every public surface in town. It was a declaration of a state of emergency. An imminent threat to the security of the railroad and the safety of this community has been identified. The notice screamed in bold letters, "The Apache warrior, Taza Nantan, in league with local dissidents, is suspected of a plot to sabotage the rail line. As evidence of this threat, explosives have been discovered planted at the Hart Spring watering station." It was a lie so audacious, so venomous, that it took Nell's breath away. He had taken their actions at Redwash and twisted them into an act of terrorism, using the town's deepest prejudices as his weapon. He was not just trying to discredit her. He was trying to get Taza killed. She found Taza by the creek on the edge of town. He had already heard. The news was a poison that had already seeped into the town's bloodstream. Men who had nodded to him in passing now averted their eyes. "They will form a posse," Taza said, his voice devoid of emotion. He was watching the water as if it held the answers. "They will not wait for a trial." "Then you must not let them find you," she said, her voice urgent. "Go! Disappear into the hills until this is over." He turned to look at her, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of something deeply weary in his eyes. "I have been disappearing my whole life. My people have been erased from the land, from the law. If I run now, it is the same as saying he is right, that I am just a shadow, a thing to be feared in the dark." He stood up straighter. "I will testify. I will speak the truth in their hearing." The risk was enormous. He would be walking into a room full of men who had been taught since birth to hate and fear him. Her heart ached with the injustice of it. She stepped closer to him, her resolve hardening into something unbreakable. "Then you will not stand alone," she said, her voice fierce and low. "If they call you a shadow, I will light a fire and stand beside you." The arrival of the United States Marshal 2 days later changed the texture of the conflict. Marshal Brody was not a man like Kincaid. He was a tall, stern man with cold blue eyes and a jaw that looked like it had been carved from granite. He was not for sale. His loyalty was to the letter of the law, a rigid and unbending code. He listened to Boone's accusations and to Nell's counterclaims with the same impassive expression. "I am not here to settle property disputes," he told Judge Miller, his voice as dry as the dust in the street. "I am here to investigate a federal crime sabotage of a railroad right-of-way. I will hear testimony from all parties tomorrow morning in the town hall." He was not corrupt, but in his rigid adherence to procedure, he was almost as dangerous. He would not be swayed by emotion or by appeals to justice. He would only be swayed by evidence. And so Nell prepared her evidence. With Taza's help, she drew a detailed timeline of events. She sketched the wagon tracks at her spring, showing how they matched the ruts left by Boone's freight wagons. She gathered testimony from the Mexican ranchers about the timeline of Kincaid's movements. It was a case built not on passion, but on the cold, hard logic of the desert, a language of signs and tracks that the marshal, a man of facts, might understand. The town hall was packed. The air was thick with tension and the smell of sweat and dust. One side of the room was filled with Boone's men and the Anglo teamsters who depended on his wages. The other side was a patchwork of her supporters, Rafaela, Mr. Grady, the silent, watchful faces of the Mexican and Navajo families who had come to stand with her. In the middle were the undecided, the townspeople whose fear was at war with their sense of fairness. Boone spoke first, his voice smooth and confident. He spoke of progress, of manifest destiny, of the sacred duty to protect the nation's expansion from the forces of savagery and chaos. He painted Taza as a dangerous renegade, a ghost of a bloody past, and Nell as his misguided, hysterical accomplice. Then Marshal Brody called Taza to testify. A low, ugly murmur went through the room. Taza walked to the front, his expression calm, his posture erect. He did not look at the hostile faces. He looked at the marshal. He spoke simply, clearly, and without emotion, describing what he had seen at the spring and at Red Wash. He answered the marshal's questions with direct, unadorned facts. He was not asking for their belief, he was simply presenting the truth. Finally, it was Nell's turn. She walked to the front of the room, her uncle's deed, the stolen papers, and her own baptismal certificate in her hand. She did not look at Boone. She looked at the faces in the crowd, at her neighbors. "Mr. Boone speaks of progress and security," she began, her voice clear and strong, ringing with a confidence she did not know she possessed. "But his kind of progress is built on theft, and his security is built on fear. I am not here today to ask for your pity. I am here to make a business proposal." A ripple of surprise went through the room. "This is not just about my spring. It is about the future of San Miguel. When that railroad is built, this town will grow. The freight wagons will need water. The work crews will need water. The passengers will need water. If Mr. Boone controls that spring, he controls the price. He can charge whatever he wants, and you will have to pay it." She saw a flicker of understanding in the eyes of the Anglo Teamsters. She was no longer talking about justice. She was talking about their livelihoods. "I have a different plan," she continued. "I will honor my uncle's deed. Hart Spring will be open to all, but it will be run as a business, not a charity. I will establish a fair price for the water, a price that is the same for everyone. Be they railroad man or rancher, the price will be adjusted by season, higher in the dry months, lower in the wet, to encourage conservation. I will keep a public ledger right here in town, showing every dollar taken in and every dollar spent on the upkeep of the station. And for security," she looked directly at the marshal, "I will hire 2 men from this town to act as station managers. We will protect the spring, not with false accusations and planted evidence, but with honest work and community trust." She had won them. She could feel the shift in the room, the tide of opinion turning. She had offered them not a fight, but a future that was fair, transparent, and profitable for everyone. Judge Miller, who had been watching the crowd, saw it too. He stood up, his voice firm and clear for the first time in weeks. "Marshal Brody, based on the evidence presented today, and on the clear will of this community, I am issuing a legal injunction. The railroad's requisition of Hart Spring is hereby suspended until the territorial court can rule on the matter." Marshal Brody listened, his expression unchanging. He looked at Boone, whose face had become a tight mask of fury. Then he looked at the box of so-called explosives that had been presented as evidence. "As for this matter of sabotage," he said, his voice cutting through the silence, "these sticks are old prospecting dynamite. Their fuses rotten. They could not blow a hat off a man's head." He turned to one of his deputies. "Confiscate this garbage and put it under lock and key." Boone's weapon had been disarmed. His plan had been dismantled. Not by a gun, but by a woman with a ledger and a better idea. As the crowd began to file out, their voices buzzing with the morning's events, Nell knew that this was not the end. A man like Boone, cornered and publicly humiliated, would not simply accept defeat. The war of the pen was over. She had a terrible feeling that the war of fire and blood was about to begin. The victory in the town hall was a fragile thing, a temporary truce in a war that was far from over. Nell felt it in the way Silas Boone looked at her before he left the hall, his polite smile gone, replaced by a cold, reptilian stillness that promised retribution. That night, the air itself seemed to hold its breath. There was no wind, and the stars were sharp and brilliant in the black sky. a silent audience to the coming drama. The attack came without warning. A volley of gunshots from the darkness, aimed not at people, but at the lanterns hung around the spring. One by one, the lights shattered, plunging the small settlement into near total darkness, illuminated only by the cold, distant starlight. Then came the torches, blooming like malevolent flowers in the night as Boone and a dozen of his men rode down from the canyon, their faces grim in the flickering light. They were not there to argue or to threaten. They were there to erase. They threw their torches into the dry brush surrounding the spring and onto the roof of the small cabin. The fire caught with a hungry roar, the flames leaping from bush to tree, casting a hellish, dancing light across the canyon walls. It was a scene of pure, destructive fury, a tantrum of fire and rage. But the town was ready. A warning shot from one of the men Nell had hired as a guard had echoed through the quiet streets, a prearranged signal. Within minutes, a stream of people was heading toward the canyon, carrying buckets, shovels, and wet blankets. It was a strange army, Mr. Grady, Rafaela, the Mexican ranchers, even some of the Anglo teamsters who, just that morning, had stood with Boone. Nell's appeal to their shared future, to their own pockets, had been more powerful than Boone's brand of loyalty. The scene at the spring was chaos, a swirling inferno of smoke and heat. Boone and his men were pushing the fire toward the main wellhead, trying to destroy the very heart of the spring. But then, the land itself seemed to intervene. A low moan of wind whispered down from the high mesas, a cool breath in the superheated air. It was a small shift, a subtle change in the night's breathing, but its effect was immediate and catastrophic. The wind, which had been pushing the flames toward the spring, now turned back on itself. It caught the blaze and hurled it back toward the canyon entrance, directly at the heavy wagon Boone had brought with him, the wagon laden with his own supplies and, as they would soon discover, crates of blasting powder. The wind is turning. Taza's voice cut through the roar of the fire. He had appeared as if from the earth itself, moving with a calm, focused intensity that cut through the panic. Do not fight the center. We must clear a path for it. Let it burn itself out toward the rocks. He began directing the men, his knowledge of the land's currents turning him into a natural general. He showed them where to throw their water, not at the highest flames, but at the edges, creating channels and fire breaks, guiding the blaze as a rancher would guide a stampeding herd. He was not fighting the fire, he was speaking its language. Nell, meanwhile, was organizing the chaos. She saw the disorganized effort of people running back and forth to the creek and knew it was too slow. A line she shouted, her voice raw from the smoke. Form a line from the creek to the cabin. People looked at her, their faces smudged with soot, their eyes wide with fear. But they listened. They formed a human chain, passing buckets of water from hand to hand with a steady, rhythmic desperation. It was a simple, powerful machine of human cooperation, and with every bucket that was passed, a small bit of the fire was beaten back. Rafaela took charge of the children who had followed their parents, keeping them at a safe distance from the main blaze. She had them soaking blankets and burlap sacks in the creek, then using them to beat out the smaller, creeping embers that threatened to spread the fire anew. They were winning. The coordinated attack was turning the tide. The main fire, starved of fuel by Taza's fire breaks and hammered by Nell's bucket brigade, was beginning to shrink. But Boone was a man who would rather rule over ashes than accept defeat. Nell saw him through a shifting curtain of smoke. He was standing near the edge of a rock ledge that overlooked the spring, and he was not alone. He had his arm locked around Rafaela's neck, a long-barreled pistol pressed to her temple. That is enough. Boone's voice was a ragged roar of desperation. He had lost control of his fire, of his men, of his plan. This was the last, desperate move of a cornered animal. Most of his men, seeing the fire turn and hearing the entire town arrive, had already faded back into the darkness. The bucket line faltered. A cold, sick silence fell over the clearing. the crackle of the flames suddenly deafening. Nell walked forward, out of the line, until she was standing in the open, the firelight flickering on her face. Taza moved silently to a position a few yards to her left, a rock in each of his hands. "Let her go! Boone!" Nell said, her voice shaking but clear. "I need this water," he snarled, his eyes wild. "I do not need the blood, but I will have the water." "I choose to keep both," she replied, her voice ringing with a strength she did not feel. His eyes narrowed. "You have cost me everything." He began to drag Rafaela toward the wagon, toward the explosives, a mad idea forming in his desperate mind. At the same time, he raised a burning torch he had grabbed, preparing to hurl it into a large barrel of kerosene used for the station's lamps. It all happened in a fraction of a second. As Boone's arm went back with the torch, Nell's pistol was in her hand. She did not aim for his chest. She did not aim for his head. Her mind was a sharp, cold point of focus. The third rule: protect a life. Her gun bucked in her hand. The shot was deafening. Boone screamed, not in pain, but in shock, as the small, cylindrical blasting cap he had been holding in his other hand, the detonator for his explosives, was torn from his grasp, sent spinning into the darkness. At the exact same moment, as Boone's momentum carried him forward with the torch, his arm swinging toward the kerosene, Taza moved. He was not a gunman. He was a force of nature. He launched himself from the shadows, his body low and powerful, and slammed into Boone's side. The impact was brutal. The torch flew from Boone's hand, landing harmlessly in the dirt. Boone himself was sent staggering sideways, his feet slipping on the edge of the rocky ledge. He teetered there for a moment, his arms windmilling, before crashing down onto a lower shelf of rock, his leg twisting beneath him at an unnatural angle. A new sound cut through the night, the thunder of approaching horses. Marshal Brody and 3 deputies galloped into the clearing, their guns drawn. They had been alerted by the rider Nell had sent as soon as the attack began. They took in the scene in a single, sweeping glance: the fire, the armed townspeople, the woman held hostage, the man lying broken on the rocks below. One of the deputies was a man Nell had not seen before. He saw the trussed figure of Deputy Kincaid being led out of the darkness by Mr. Grady. The deputy's face was a mask of terror and resignation. The game was over. "He did it," Kincaid blurted out, his voice a pathetic whine. "Boone, the explosives were his idea. He made me plant them. He made me do all of it." The fight was over. Marshal Brody cuffed a moaning, defeated Silas Boone. His remaining men surrendered without a fight. The townspeople, their faces a mixture of soot, sweat, and overwhelming relief, finally extinguished the last of the flames. Nell stood there, her pistol still hanging limply in her hand, a fine tremor running through her entire body. The smell of gunpowder and burnt wood filled her lungs. She had fired her gun at a man. She had made a choice between one life and another. The weight of it was crushing. Taza came and stood beside her. He did not touch her, but his presence was a solid, calming anchor in the swirling aftermath of the violence. He looked from her pale, trembling face to the dying embers of the fire. "You chose life," he said, his voice quiet and simple, yet it cut through all the noise in her head. "That is enough." She looked at the spring. The fire was out. The water was safe. The surface of the creek, no longer reflecting the angry orange of the flames, was now a calm, dark mirror. And in it, scattered like a handful of diamonds, were the brilliant, unwavering stars. The image of their first night of freedom returned to her, not as a memory, but as a benediction. As Marshal Brody led Boone and his men away, the people of San Miguel stood together, their faces lit by the coming dawn. They looked at the saved spring, and then they looked at the 2 figures standing beside it, the quiet Apache man who had taught them how to read the wind, and the determined young woman who had taught them how to stand as one. In the ashes of the battle, 2 new pillars of the community had been forged. In the days that followed the fire, A new kind of quiet settled over San Miguel. It was not the tense, watchful silence that had preceded the violence, but a stillness of exhaustion, reflection, and tentative hope. The charred earth around the spring stood as a stark reminder of how close they had come to ruin, but the water itself still flowed, clear and constant, a promise of resilience. The town had been tested by fire, and it had not broken. A week after Boone was taken away in irons, Judge Miller convened a town meeting. This time, the hall was not divided into factions. People sat where they would, a jumbled collection of ranchers, teamsters, merchants, and families. Their face turned toward the front of the room where Nell stood, not as a defendant or a petitioner, but as the acknowledged guardian of their most precious resource. She did not speak with the fire of the previous hearing, but with a calm, measured practicality. She laid out the rules of the new Heart Spring, the business proposal she had made, now fleshed out with the common sense of the community. The price of water would be set on a sliding scale, pegged to the seasons and the depth of the well, a system that made intuitive sense to everyone who lived by the whims of the sky. Priority would be given to medical transports and to families with young children, a rule that was met with solemn, universal nods, and a new law, harsh and absolute, was passed by a unanimous show of hands. Any person caught deliberately damaging the spring or its equipment would be banished from the territory, their property forfeit. It was the law of a people who understood that thirst was a more terrible sentence than any jail cell. In the midst of this new order, Taza found a new and unexpected role: the railroad company. Its reputation in the territory, singed by Boone's actions, sent a new supervisor, a pragmatic engineer from the east named Hayes. He saw Taza not as a threat, but as an asset. He offered Taza a lucrative contract to scout the safest and most stable routes for the final push of the rail line. Taza listened to the offer, his expression unreadable. He then made a counteroffer of his own. He would teach Hayes's men. He would teach them how to read the signs of a coming flash flood, how to find water where none seemed to exist, how to move through the land without angering it. He would do this, but not for money. He would do it in exchange for a binding, ironclad promise from the railroad that the track would not cross the sacred grounds in the high mesas, that the ancient burial sites of his people would be left in peace. Hayes, a man who respected knowledge and understood the cost of losing men to this harsh land, agreed without hesitation. Taza was no longer a shadow at the edge of their world. He was a teacher, a bridge between two civilizations, forging a truce built not on surrender, but on mutual respect and practical need. Nell, for her part, brought her own revolution to San Miguel. She purchased a thick, sturdy ledger book from the general store and nailed a small lectern to the outside wall of Rafaela's cantina. Each day, she would record the day's water sales, the name of each teamster, the amount taken, and the price paid. She noted every expenditure, from a new bucket to the wages for the 2 men hired to manage the station. It was the Sonuak, the water ledger, and it was open for all to see. This simple act of transparency was more powerful than any lock or guard. It replaced suspicion with trust. One afternoon, as a show of this new trust, Mr. Grady arrived at the spring with 2 of his apprentices, hauling a brand-new, gleaming iron hand pump on a wagon. The old one was weak, the blacksmith said gruffly, avoiding her eyes. This one will pull from the deep part of the aquifer. A gift from the town. It was an investment, a statement that Heart Spring was no longer just her property. It was the heart of their community. The deep-seated prejudices did not vanish overnight. There were still a few of the Anglo freighters who would mutter into their beer about her partnership with the Apache, but their grumbling was quiet, and it was drowned out by the simple, undeniable logic of a full canteen and a fair price. The shared work of rebuilding the burned cabin, of reinforcing the wellhead, of digging the foundations for the new pump, began to heal the rifts between them. Men who had stood on opposite sides of a fight now stood side by side, their sweat and labor mingling in the same red dirt. The world began to feel normal again. a new kind of normal. The first rain of the season came. Not a violent storm, but a soft, steady shower that washed the last of the soot from the rocks and filled the air with a rich, intoxicating scent of wet earth. That evening, Nell, Taza, and Rafaela sat together on the cantina's porch, watching the water darken the streets. "Well," Rafaela said, breaking the comfortable silence, "now that you two have saved the world, there is a small matter to discuss." Nell and Taza both looked at her. "My sleep," Rafaela continued, her expression perfectly serious. "So if you two decide to have a disagreement, and I'm sure you will, because all people do, please remember to do it quietly. I am a light sleeper." A slow smile spread across her face, and Nell felt a genuine, unburdened laugh bubble up inside her. A few nights later, when a full moon bathed the landscape in a soft, silver light, they rode out together. Neither of them said where they were going, but they both knew. They followed the familiar path to the hidden basin, to the small, starlit creek. The place was unchanged, a perfect, secret sanctuary. They sat by the water's edge, the silence between them as deep and as comfortable as the night sky. The fear and desperation that had filled this space on their first visit were gone, replaced by a quiet, profound peace. This was the place where their partnership had been forged in a moment of shared danger. Now, it was a place where something else, something deeper and more personal, could finally be acknowledged. Nell trailed her fingers in the cold water, watching the ripples distort the reflection of the stars. She was keenly aware of him sitting beside her, of the space between them that was no longer a measure of caution, but of respect. He moved slightly, and the back of his hand brushed against hers. It was a light, almost accidental touch, but it sent a jolt of warmth through her. He did not pull away. After a long moment, she turned her hand, her palm meeting his. His fingers closed gently around hers. A silent question and a silent answer, all in one. They sat like that for a long time, hand in hand, listening to the murmur of the creek and the breathing of the night, two solitary people who had found in each other a solace against the vast, wild heart of the land. The following Sunday, a small, informal gathering took place at the spring. Father Deacon was there, and he spoke a simple blessing, not of a place, but of a community, of the way water can wash away bitterness and make new things grow. The Mexican and Navajo families came, bringing gifts not of money, but of things from the earth, baskets of blue corn, strings of dried chilies, and a beautiful, intricately woven wreath of sweetgrass and wild feathers. There were no grand speeches, just quiet smiles and nods of genuine respect. The next afternoon, the stagecoach from Tucson rattled into town, and with it came a letter. It was from the Territorial Law Office, a thick, formal envelope addressed to Nell. She opened it with trembling fingers. The legalese was dense, but the meaning was clear. The court had reviewed the case. Boone's fraudulent claims had been dismissed, and her title to Heart Spring was now affirmed, permanent and incontestable. She read the final paragraph, her heart giving a sudden, powerful leap. It was a clause she had added herself, in a letter she had sent to the lawyer a week before, and in recognition of his vital role in the protection and preservation of this resource. Taza Nantan is hereby named as a lifetime trustee of the Heart Spring Water Company, with equal say in its management and equal share in its duties and profits. She lowered the letter and looked across the clearing at Taza, who was showing one of the young Mexican boys how to track the path of a lizard in the dust. He felt her gaze on him and looked up. She held up the letter, a slow smile spreading across her face. He did not need to read the words. He saw the truth in her eyes, and in his, she saw a future, as clear and as promising as the water that flowed from the heart of the earth. The years that followed were etched not in dramatic events, but in the slow, steady rhythm of the seasons. San Miguel grew, not with the explosive, transient boom of a gold rush town, but with the deep, solid roots of a community that had found its center. That center was Heart's Spring. The railroad came, its iron tracks glinting in the sun, but it did not cleave the valley in two as Taza had feared. Instead, it brought a steady stream of commerce and new faces, all of whom, sooner or later, found their way to the spring. Over the well, a new, hand-carved wooden sign was hung, its letters burned deep into the wood. It did not bear the boastful claims of a new enterprise, but the quiet promise of a new philosophy. Heart's Spring, all who thirst. Come fair. The sign was a testament to the legacy they were building, a legacy of water and of people. The future was brighter, but it was still the West, a land of harsh realities. Droughts came, as they always had, leaving the earth cracked and gasping, the sky a vast, empty bowl of blue. In other towns, these times led to hoarding, to price gouging, to violence. But in San Miguel, the laws of the spring held fast. Nell's ledger, its pages now filled with years of entries, was their constitution. The sliding scale of prices, the priority for the vulnerable, the shared responsibility for the resource, these were not just rules. They were the articles of their survival. They had learned the hard way that justice was not something that was handed down from a judge's bench. It was a pact you made with your neighbors on how to share the water. Nell had changed. The young woman who had ridden out of town seeking only her own patch of freedom had become the architect of a community's liberty. She still managed the spring, her mind for numbers and fairness, now a respected town institution. But she had learned to balance the ledger of her heart with the ledger of her business. She had found that the freedom she had craved was not a solitary escape, but a shared creation. A web of trust and mutual respect that was stronger than any fence post. Taza, too, had found a new path. He was no longer a silent warrior at the edge of town, but a respected teacher at its heart. His classes on survival and trailcraft became a rite of passage for the railroad men, for the new settlers, and even for the sons of the very cowboys who had once looked upon him with contempt. He taught them the language of the land, and in doing so, he ensured that the wisdom of his people would not be lost, but would become part of the valley's new identity. He had learned that true, lasting victory was not found in defeating an enemy, but in teaching them how to live in peace with the land you both now called home. Their love story was not one of grand, sweeping passions or dramatic rescues. It was a quieter, stronger thing, written in the daily work of their lives. It was in the way he would bring her a strangely shaped stone he had found on his travels, and the way she would save him the last of the strong coffee she brewed each morning. It was in the shared silence as they watched the sun set behind the mesas, a silence that needed no words to fill it. Love, they had discovered, was not just in the finding of another person, but in the staying, in the quiet, tireless work of building a life together. The scarred land around the spring had healed, covered now with hardy desert grasses and wildflowers. The rebuilt cabin was their home, a solid, comfortable place that smelled of wood smoke, leather, and her cooking. The hidden creek in the basin remained their secret, a sacred place they would retreat to when the world grew too loud. And the stars, the brilliant Apache stars under which she had declared her freedom, were a constant, silent witness to the life they had built, a reminder of the promise they had made to themselves and to each other. One evening, as they sat on the porch of their cabin, watching the first stars begin to prick the deep indigo of the sky, Nell leaned her head against his shoulder. "I used to think freedom was a straight line," she said, her voice soft with memory. "A road that you just rode as fast as you could, straight west, until you ran out of land." Taza was silent for a long moment, his hand finding hers in the growing dark. He smiled, a slow, genuine smile that held all the wisdom of the ancient land. "Freedom is a rain path," he said, his voice a low, gentle rumble. "It twists, and it turns. It follows the thirst of the land, but if you have the patience to follow it, the land will bloom." The feeling they had created in this small corner of the world was a warm and real thing. It was a peace that acknowledged its scars, a hope that was tempered by the hard realities of the desert. It was a place where the most precious things were not gold or silver, but the taste of clean water and the weight of a promise kept. The next week, the stage brought another letter from Tucson. It was not from a lawyer this time, but from the editor of the Sentinel. The articles Rafaela had sent had caused a stir. People across the territory were talking about the small town that had stood up to the railroad and won, not with guns, but with a better idea. The editor was inviting Nell to write a series of columns about her experiences. He had even suggested a title, The Law of Springs. She sat at her small wooden desk that night, a clean sheet of paper before her, the light from the oil lamp casting a warm glow on her face. She thought for a long moment, then dipped her pen in the ink. She began to write, her first words a testament to everything she had learned. In the thirstiest of places, she wrote, "Justice must know how to water the ground." Thank you for listening to our story. Please comment below and let us know where you are listening from, so we can all connect and share our thoughts. And please subscribe to my channel, Wild West Tales, like this video. And support us further by pressing the hype button so this story can be heard by more people.